Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. And today, again, we're starting in the Bakhmut area of operations. The Russians right now are reporting, at least elements of the Wagner organization are reporting that they have captured the center of Bakhmut. We do know that fighting continues. House to house, street to street fighting continues. Very heavy fighting is continuing, especially infantry units engaging each other in Bakhmut. We do know that the Ukrainians have turned every building, every house, every area in Bakhmut into an essentially a defensive redoubt. And I want to look at that a little bit. I want to talk about why hasn't the Russians taken Bakhmut yet, and why the Ukrainians are continuing to defend Bakhmut, even though they have been encircled and a large contingent of their forces quite possibly will be either captured, wounded, or killed in action in the course of the battle. Well, the big reason, the big issue that we have not seen the Russians absolutely just level Bakhmut. Look, the Russians could take Bakhmut probably in about 4 to 5 days if they wanted to. And that would call for the leveling of Bakhmut. Make no mistake, the Russians, if they wanted to, could absolutely level Bakhmut. All these defensive positions that the Russians are using infantry to take these positions, the Russians have the ability, again, to absolutely level Bakhmut. That would include bunkers, trenches, fortifications, all of which are static in position. And the Russian Air Force, the Russian heavy artillery, multiple launch rocket systems would just level the city. If you look at a case study of the second war in Chechnya, where the Russians encircled Grozny and then conducted a very methodical operation to defeat Chechen units in Grozny. That was a methodical operation where they used lots of artillery. In some cases, they were using 4,000 artillery shells a day just in Grozny, okay? And they were able to level that city, or level the areas in which the Chechens were using as defensive redoubts. They could use that same tactic here in Bakhmut, but they're not doing it. The reason they're not doing it, and the Ukrainians are taking advantage of this, is there are Russian supporters. There are thousands of Russian citizens that believe themselves part of the Russian Federation that live in Bakhmut. They're not leaving. They don't want to go deeper into Ukraine. They want to be part of the Russian Federation. And the Russians aren't going to kill those 5,000, 6,000 Russian-speaking, well, most of Ukrainian is Russian-speaking, but they're not going to, the Russians, are not going to kill those 5,000 to 6,000 Russians in Bakhmut to take Bakhmut. Now, the Ukrainians are taking advantage of that. They know, the Ukrainians are very well aware that the Russians, at least right now, have no intent of using massive amounts of heavy artillery against targets in Bakhmut in a saturation exercise to destroy all defensive redoubts. So they're using Bakhmut as a way to engage Russian forces in close quarters combat, where they have the advantage. They, the Ukrainians, obviously, have the advantage because they have built up defensives in this city for some time now. And unfortunately for the Russians, they're having to go house to house, street by street, to clear these areas of Ukrainian forces. Which makes it more difficult is the the Russians have also blocked the ability of the Ukrainians to move in and out of Bakhmut freely. I think if the Russians allowed the Ukrainians a free movement out of Bakhmut, they may take it. They may take it. But right now, that's not the case. It would be very difficult for Ukrainian forces to get out of Bakhmut and not be hit massively by Russian artillery, aircraft, what have you. So they have to stay, and they're fighting for the city. And again, the Russians aren't simply going to obliterate the city. Yeah, we hear reports, obviously, that the Russians are using heavy artillery. But for the most part, they're calling in fairly precise fires on Ukrainian positions where they know the Ukrainian positions are. Again, they could just saturate, and this is not a big city. There's nothing preventing Russian forces from just obliterating this area. It's not a large area. And there's a fairly high concentration of Ukrainian forces in the area. So that's the reason right now we're continuing to see this fight for Bakhmut. We'll see how it all ends here in the future. We'll very quickly do a kind of you, the viewer, can see what's happened over the course of the last few days. And we'll start from March 28th. And you can kind of see this, again, this house by house, this street by street, quite literally block by block, with these specialized assault groups from both the Russian VDV and the Wagner formations as well. So here we go. See? And again, it's just a methodical, classic infantry operation designed to clear Bakhmut. They're not trying to level it. Otherwise, the Russians would have already been in Bakhmut. So again, that's why we're seeing what we're seeing in Bakhmut, and we'll probably continue to see it until the Russians are able to completely clear the city, and the Ukrainians, on their part, will continue to defend the city and try to move forces out in hopes of they will not take a huge loss in terms of manpower, and they'll try to get whatever they can out of the city. But it's difficult for those forces, those Ukrainian forces, to get out of the city right now. In other news, I find it interesting. I was watching, having a look at another content provider. This is a pro-Ukrainian supporter who happens to have fled to Germany. And he is discussing the Ukrainian intelligence operation in which they struck a civilian cafe in St. Petersburg, Russia, to assassinate a Russian military blogger. Now, it's interesting to kind of see Western response, Ukrainian response to that attack. And I think it's a good instance in which we can compare and contrast what we are watching on TV. Now, if this attack were to have happened in Berlin, London, the United States, Western media, Ukraine, Western countries would be calling this attack in this St. Petersburg cafe a terrorist attack by a terror state. Russia, the terror state, launches an attack in Berlin to assassinate a social media personality. Now, when that happens in St. Petersburg, that's not what you hear. They call it Darwinism. Darwinism. So again, if the Russian FSB were to have attacked a Ukrainian blogger, content provider in, say, Warsaw, and blow up a cafe, injured a bunch of people, and killed that social media personality, that content provider, terrorist state, a terrorist action. Let's do something about this. St. Petersburg the exact same thing occurs, and it's Darwinism. I got to do another knock. Anyway, I find that a bit disconcerting, and you can kind of see the way the narrative is shaped in terms of the news that you watch, and that's part of the reason I do this channel, to call upon this hypocrisy. Again, the Ukrainian, or quite possibly the Central Intelligence Agency, launches an attack on a St. Petersburg cafe to kill this Russian blogger. Darwinism. He shouldn't be saying what he is saying, and that's what's got him killed. But FSB operation, Russian operation, which to my knowledge has not occurred in the West, terrorist state. So it's just interesting to compare and contrast those two issues. It's very interesting to see how the Ukrainian side shapes that narrative and talks about how they believe that whatever was done in St. Petersburg was for the right reason. But I think you're then opening a Pandora's box, and other content providers could then be at risk for attack by the opposing sides. Again, however you feel about what this individual in St. Petersburg was saying, he was a civilian, and he was reporting his view on what was happening on the ground. And in all probability, we saw a Ukrainian intel operation to assassinate him. Darwinism. That's what they're calling it. So that's kind of where we're at for today. We will continue to watch the situation in Bakhmut very, very closely. We do believe the Russians continue to tighten the grip on the city, continue their infantry assaults with these smaller assault groups, clearing out pockets of Ukrainian resistance, and the Ukrainians continue to fight for the city. Again, the Ukrainians are taking advantage of what's happening on the ground in Bakhmut because they know that they're just not going to get leveled by Russian air power because, again, of the Russian supporters who are still in the city, essentially waiting to be liberated. Say what you want, but that's just the fact. That's what's happening on the ground. These are not pro-Ukrainians living in Bakhmut. They're not. So we'll continue to keep an eye on the situation, continue to report the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Have a good day.